dead reckoning. The corpse that followed the ship to its doom. The Isle of Scilly disaster of 1707 was one of the greatest single maritime disasters in British history, during which the Admiralty lost 4 ships, including their flagship, and up to 2,000 sailors. There were a number of causes for the loss: bad visibility, inadequate means of gauging longitude at the time, and of course the devastating storm that hit the fleet off one of the most dangerous isles off the British coastline. But there is an enduring legend that it was a curse uttered by a condemned sailor that sent the ships to their doom, and that the sailor's corpse even followed the ships to their fate on the rocks of the isle. In the late summer of 1707, during the War of the Spanish Succession, an allied British, Austrian and Dutch force was laying siege to the French port of Toulon. It was not going the Allies' way, so Britain sent a fleet to provide naval support, led by Commander-in-Chief of the British fleets, Sir Cloudesley Shovel. Shovel was a talented and respected commander who was responsible for many of Britain's naval victories of the time. And so his flagship, the HMS Association, led a fleet of 21 warships to spearhead the siege. On reaching Toulon, Cloudesley's plan was to disable the French fleet and then refloat and commandeer their ships, and though he had some small success, the siege ultimately failed, and Cloudesley was then ordered to return to England. And so his fleet turned and set sail from Gibraltar toward England on the 29th of September, just as the weather began to turn. The first few days on the return journey to England were dogged by a thick fog, making visibility near impossible, with sailing masters having to rely heavily on soundings, gauging the depth of water, and dead reckoning. That is, calculating their position by estimating the direction and distance travelled. As the days went by, the fog finally lifted, only to give way to heavy rains and strong westerly winds, but nevertheless they pushed on out into the harsh Atlantic waters. But as they passed the Bay of Biscay, conditions suddenly worsened, making it difficult on most days to even measure latitude, and the fleet continued to be dogged by grim weather, which followed them throughout their long and tortuous Atlantic journey. Finally, in late October, they reached the edge of the continental shelf, and the weather improved slightly, enough for them to measure latitude, which put them at 200 miles west-southwest off the Isle of Scilly. This was the last measurement they took before another fog descended, and for the final stretch of the journey, they reverted back to dead reckoning, which, as it turned out, was to be very aptly named. After some days of sailing with low visibility, the fleet entered the English Channel on the 22nd of October. Conditions were still murky, with cloud and drizzle and a wind blowing in from the southwest. Cloudesley carried out a series of soundings and decided that they were in the area of Isle Of Scilly, an island off the coast of Brittany, safe in the waters west of Ushant. All well. Or so he thought. Meanwhile, a ship had been sent out from Plymouth on the 21st of October to meet the returning fleet and guide it safely back to port. But on reaching their expected rendezvous point, the Admiral's fleet was nowhere to be seen. Back on the Association, one young deckhand, a Salonian who had grown up on the coast of Cornwall and who knew the coastline well, recognised where they were, and it was not Isle Of Scilly. Cloudesley had misgauged their longitude. They were in fact right next to the Isle of Scilly, off the southwest tip of Cornwall. Not only that, they were entering a notoriously dangerous natural trap where numerous ships had already gone down. The deckhand cautiously approached the admiral and told him of his own reckoning of the fleet's location during the passage, and he placed the fleet near the isle. He also warned of the danger of the location, but Cloudsley dismissed the warning as nonsense. Not only was it an affront to his leadership and navigational skills, the deckhand's attempts to influence the chartered route was also an offence known as subversive navigation. The young deckhand was putting himself in considerable trouble by challenging the admiral's command, and he knew it. But so serious was the danger they were sailing towards that he was willing, literally, to risk his neck to convince the admiral. He tried again, insisting that he had grown up on that coast, that he knew every rock and crevice, that he recognised the western rocks nearby and the danger the ship was in. Again, Cloudsley dismissed this troublesome subordinate. Having worked his way up the ranks from mere cabin boy to one of the most celebrated naval commanders of the time, he knew everything there was to know about the sea, and the deckhand was clearly hysterical. By this stage, the Scillonian must have been desperate in his efforts to get the admiral to change course. He pleaded that they were sailing to probable disaster and would soon be at the point of no return if the admiral didn't change course. Finally, Cloudsley snapped, and turning to the deckhand, he angrily accused the young man of inciting mutiny. The entire upper deck fell silent. Everybody, including the young Scillonian, knew what that meant. Cloudsley had just condemned the young man to death, and charged with mutiny, he was to be hanged from the yardarm. The yardarm of a ship is the horizontal timber pole mounted on the mast from which the sails are hung. Hanging from the yardarm was a well-established and severe punishment reserved for the most serious offences on a ship. The sailor was arrested on the spot. The commander ordered the crew to prepare for the execution, and all on board were rounded up to witness. As soon as preparations were complete, the young Scillonian who had tried to save the fleet was solemnly marched to the mast before the entire crew. Witnessing an execution was compulsory on all ships at the time, and everyone was forced to watch as a powerful warning and a deterrent. As the Scillonian's hands and feet were being bound, he made and was granted a last request for a psalm to be read. The one he chose was Psalm 109, the notorious cursing psalm. The psalm was read out as the crew silently listened, and as the words, "Let his children be fatherless and his wife a widow," were being read, the condemned sailor repeated them, turning his eyes to Sir Cloudsley for a long moment before shifting his gaze to all those bearing witness to his final moments, his last words hinting that neither Cloudsley nor any of those present would reach the shore alive. Then the noose was placed around his neck, and the rope was run through a pulley from the yardarm to a team of sailors on the other side. The ritualistic, almost theatrical nature of the yardarm execution was almost as gruesome as the execution itself. Once everything was ready, the fatal bow gun was fired to signal the start of the execution, and the team of sailors then began slowly hauling on the rope, hoisting the victim upwards at least 30 feet towards the yardarm. It was a slow and grisly process of strangulation. In some cases there would be cannon shot, a cannonball, weighing about 30 pounds tied to the feet, in order to quicken the death of the condemned somewhat. Whether this was done in the Scillonian's case is not recorded. Once he was directly underneath the yardarm, he was held there and left to hang for at least half an hour to make sure he was dead. When Cloudsley was satisfied that the insubordinate was deceased, his body was lowered again onto the deck where it was wrapped in a shroud, normally a hammock. Cannon shot was then placed in with it to weigh the body down in the water, and if shot had been used as a weight during the execution, it was placed in the shroud with him, before the sheet was closed over, wrapped, and tied up. The sailor's body was then lowered into the water, and the crew silently watched as it sank below the waves and faded out of view. Then the crew solemnly got back to work, all with their own thoughts about what had just occurred. And now that Cloudsley was rid of the young upstart, he prepared to sail on. But no sooner had the Admiral got rid of one problem than a much more serious one appeared on the horizon with a loud crack and an ominous rumble. There was a cry from the crow's nest, and the Admiral looked up. The lookout was pointing to a bank of dark clouds on fire in the distance as lightning flashed all around them, jumping from one to the other, then striking the sea below. A gathering storm, and it was headed straight for the fleet. And as the fast approaching clouds turned black and torrential rains began to chop at the waves in the distance, they realised this wasn't just any storm. This was a tempest, and it was rapidly gaining. Thunder rolled and hammered across the sky as each man scrambled to his station, and as they braced for impact, there was another sudden cry, this time of abject horror. The body of the executed Solonian had just resurfaced, no longer wrapped in its shroud, and it was floating nearby with the rising waves, its head turned towards the ship, facing it, as if staring at the crew it had just cursed. And then the tempest hit. The HMS Association was lifted and thrown back onto the waves as if a leviathan had taken hold of her, as the fury of the tempest harried and shunted the flagship further and further towards the western rocks. The crew fought hard, desperately trying with everything they had to change the ship's course, but try as they might, there was little they could do against the power of the storm. Giant waves battered and flooded the deck, while the corpse of the hanged sailor rose and fell with every wave, sometimes above them facing down from the crest of a gigantic wave, sometimes below them facing up, but all the time facing the crew of the cursed ship, staring with its lifeless, bulging eyes as it followed them close by, as they were hurtled to their doom. The HMS Association was the first to be smashed against the outer gillstone off the western rocks. It was 8 o'clock in the evening. The horrified fleet watched the broken ship sink under the waves in less than 4 minutes, along with the entire crew of approximately 800, including Admiral Cloudsley. There would be no survivors. The once proud flagship that had survived the Great Cyclone of 1703 was little more than a shattered ornament in the hands of this furious storm. It's difficult to know the exact point at which Cloudsley would have realised that the man he had executed had been right all along, and at what point it dawned on him that if he had listened to the young man, he and his crew would be sailing away on a different course and not spending their final moments gasping for breath as they were bashed against the rocks. Following behind was the HMS St. George, which also struck the rocks and, although damaged, still managed with some struggle to get back off and away out of danger. The HMS Phoenix ran aground between Tresco and St. Martin's, but true to its name, it also survived intact and was still seaworthy. Not so for the HMS Eagle, which was next to be driven onto the rocks, her nearly 30 years at sea brought to a crushing end as she hit the Crim Rock, and despite all efforts on board was shredded and lost on the tearing ledge in the western rocks. Again, all crew went down with the ship and were lost, with estimates of up to 800 lives. She sank just a few hundred yards from Bishop's Rock as the rest of the fleet desperately tried to wrestle their ships away from the churning graveyard ahead of them. Shortly afterwards, the HMS Romney was also forced by the waves onto Bishop's Rock, going down with all 290 crew except one, Quartermaster George Lawrence, who had managed to make it to shore and was dragged to safety by rescuers on the Isle. The fact that there was even one survivor from the Romney in all the carnage was a small miracle and a testament to the bravery of the people who helped rescue him. The HMS Firebrand also hit the Gilstone Rock, but by an amazing stroke of luck was suddenly lifted back off by a following wave. The crew took the chance to steer the badly damaged ship towards the southern side of the rocks between Agnes and Annet, but her luck deserted her just as quickly, and she went down near Menglow Rock, losing most of her 40 crew. The rest of the fleet managed to heave to out of danger, as the surviving crews desperately steered their ships away from the western rocks. By the time the Tempest had faded back into the skies where it came from, there were between 1,500 and 2,000 sailors dead, all rising and falling in the waves alongside the corpse of the sailor they had hanged. It remains today one of the worst disasters to have hit the British Navy. Amongst the dead were Admiral Cloudsley and his two stepsons, John and James. The Admiral himself was washed ashore in Porthelic Bay on the hatch of a ship, and his body was later found by a soldier and his wife. Beside him on the hatch lay the body of a small dog. The couple who had found him then arranged for his burial on the site. There are two separate accounts of his discovery, both centered around his emerald ring. In one account, the soldier had recognized him by the distinctive ring, which he then arranged to have returned to Cloudsley's wife, who later rewarded his honesty and compassion with a pension for life. Another more intriguing account was that Cloudsley was actually still alive when he was washed up on the shore, and that he was found by a peasant woman who then murdered him for his ring. According to this version, the woman confessed her crime to a minister on her deathbed many years later. She then handed the ring to the minister, who then passed it on to the Earl of Berkeley. A small stone memorial where he was found still stands. He was later exhumed from his grave on Porthelic and brought to London, where his body was interred in Westminster Abbey. Local legend claims that a pit still remains where he was buried on the Isle, and it never fills up even during the heaviest rains, and no grass grows on the site of the burial. Maybe the wrath of the dead sailor followed him even to the spot where he died too. The other 1,500 to 2,000 crewmen who perished had no such burial and no such memorial. They were all either washed out to sea or washed up on the shore, where they were quickly buried in unmarked graves, most of them on the Isle of St. Agnes. As a direct result of this catastrophe, the Admiralty started a campaign to find a better way to gauge longitude. The Longitude Act of 1714 offered a £20,000 prize for anyone who could create a solution. This led to the invention by John Harrison of the very first marine chronometer, which revolutionised how longitude is measured. Interestingly, despite this huge development, the Isles of Scilly continue to claim ships and their crews right up to the present day. In the 19th century alone, hundreds of ships ran aground or were wrecked completely on the rocks of the Isles. As for the HMS Association, she lay where she sank for more than 260 years before she was finally discovered in 1967. So as far as the legend of the hanged sailor and the curse is concerned, how true is it? Most articles I've come across about the disaster claim the story of the curse itself is complete fiction, while many claim that even the execution itself never happened. However, there are some intriguing factors to the account. Dava Sobel, in her book Longitude, which focused on John Harrison's invention of the marine chronometer, does write about the Isle of Scilly disaster which ultimately led to Harrison's invention, and she details how a sailor on Cloudsley's ship had made an accurate reckoning of their position, but was then hanged by Cloudsley for subversive navigation. So according to her book, the story of the hanging itself appears to be a matter of record, although we don't know what the original source for that is. Also, the book The Lore of the Land by Westwood and Simpson describes the disaster and how one survivor who had floated on a spar to the Hellwethers south of Annet later told of how a Solonian sailor on the Association had repeatedly warned Cloudsley of the danger they were in, only to be hanged for insubordination. According to the book, before he was hanged, he had quoted the cursing psalm on the Admiral and his ship. Unfortunately, the book's account does not mention the survivor's name. Records do confirm the survival of George Lawrence, the quartermaster of the HMS Romney, but his name is not specifically linked to the story of the hanged sailor or the curse. But they are three very intriguing factors all the same. So it turns out, surprisingly, the legend of the curse of the hanged sailor seems to have at least some basis. The tale itself may even be true. And that is the story of the Isle of Scilly disaster and the legend of the sailor's curse. Good night, wherever you are.